Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. I'm actually going to just continue along the same line of question as Mr. Grewal. First of all, I believe it was either Marshall or it was Keynes that said that oftentimes in economics you'll have two different forces that come together, one being, in this case, NAFTA, the other one being tax reform, and cuts like a scissor. And it really doesn't matter which blade hits first or the hardest, it eventually cuts. And so would you say that right now that the tax reform and the lack of competitiveness may be the worst of the two? Or should we be advocating to the government to look at things like the capital cost allowance as a way so we can see more investment? Because I think they're at an 8-year low.
Yes, tax reform is definitely having the most immediate impact because it was passed, it's in force, and companies right now are staring at marginal effective tax rates that are significantly different between Canada and the U.S. NAFTA is more of an uncertainty that creates going forward, but we know from speaking with member companies that tax reform in the States is having an immediate impact on investment decisions in Canada.
And Mr. Grewal also raised job numbers. The PBO said that since last October, when they came for their quarterly report, they reported that 60% of the jobs that were created were actually in the public sector, and that the reduction in the unemployment rate actually had to do with more people leaving the workforce or the labor market. Are those things concerning to you?
Absolutely. I mean, we want to see a vibrant private sector in Canada, and we want to see policies put in place that support that and support the growth of companies into global champions.
Yeah. Mr. Harford, just in regards to it, my understanding is that when you add a higher price to anything, whether it be taxes or an input, that means that there are less people to purchase at a particular given price. So if your industry is on a permanent escalator tax, and you see excise tax going up while competitors are actually reducing theirs, such as the United States, that means there's less consumption for your product right off the bat, not even to say whether or not there's a marijuana legal market for it or not.
That's right. As I mentioned in my remarks, we've had 45 tax increases across the country on beer. The taxes on beer since 2010 have increased at a rate of twice the rate of inflation, and we've seen a 10% decline in per capita beer sales over the course of the last decade, and that has implications for government revenue in the long term.
Do you hear that in your industry are they bullish or are they more bearish in terms of big investments?
Right now, their number one concern is what are they going to get hit with next by way of tax?
And are some of your members considering investments south of the border versus here in Canada?
It's definitely in the mix. For our larger members that have a footprint that cross into the United States, they're doing a deep dive to see how attractive Canada remains with the result of both the rollback in beer excise tax in the United States that U.S. brewers are going to enjoy or U.S. facilities are going to enjoy, and as well as the tax reform.
So to those here regarding the cannabis issue, were all four of you consulted on this excise tax before the government made these changes in budget 2018? And if so, what was their response to your concerns that I'm sure you surely raised with them?
Who wants to start? Were you consulted any?
I was, yeah. I spoke with both Member of Parliament Sean Casey and Wayne Easter in regards to the excise tax. Sean Casey originally declined my invite to speak at an event around the excise tax, but sent forward a statement on behalf of the Liberal Party. But he didn't seem to understand. I've continuously brought patience to him to share stories. I think that's the most important thing. There's a really large stigma that is shading many people's view of medical cannabis patients. So the more we can humanize them, the more people seem to understand.
Any of the others?
We were consulted, Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana Finance, and we also reached out to members across all parties, senators, as well as different bureaucrats in different departments. With that said, I think the consultation was not as effective as we'd like to see, in the sense that the overwhelming submissions that were given, the vast majority from our understanding, were in support of eliminating tax on medical cannabis. As I mentioned, a coalition of very large, credible, respectable organizations, including the Arthritis Society, the Canadian Pharmacists Association, and the Canadian Nurses Association, have put forward a submission as part of that consultation process. But we don't feel like the government is adequately listening. There was a small step to exempt low THC oils, but that is a tiny percent of the market. It shows a complete misunderstanding for what patients are using it, and beyond that, it's not a decision that's based in evidence. The evidence shows, as James mentioned, a very strong, conclusive evidence for the treatment of chronic pain in adults, MS spasticity, and chemotherapy-induced, nausea and vomiting induced from chemotherapy. That's for THC, and that is subject to excise tax.
Dan, get time for one more.
Oh, okay, great. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report on this tax, which notes that the cannabis tax won't raise much revenue because even a fairly modest tax would enable the black market to continue, and the government wouldn't get any of the revenue. Do any of you have any comment on that? And it would seem the government is suggesting that it will raise revenue on the backs of those who are actually struggling to pay for it, for access to medical marijuana, while completely ignoring the fact that it may not raise as much revenue to begin with.
So I would absolutely agree in the sense that this excise tax is using patients to build this new legalized program. Patients have already been suffering with the continued application of GST, HST. That's a situation that means that 6 out of 10 Canadians who use cannabis for medical purposes can't afford their full dose. That number is unfathomable. This government is considering pharmacare because 1 in 10 Canadians can't afford prescription medications, and then they go around and apply an excise tax to medical cannabis when 6 in 10 Canadians can't afford a dose. That makes no sense.
Okay, before I turn to Mr. Dussault, on the Mr. Harford, on the 10% decline in beer sales, does that include craft breweries?
It's the total market.
Total market,
Yeah,
okay.
on a volume
Thank you.
basis.
Mr. Dussault.